Hello, my name is Elliot of TallNerdTV and welcome to this week's episode of Box to Box Score for game week 30 in the EFSA Premier League and the Championship. And the thing I love about this time of season is that pretty much every game means something. There's the relegation fights in the Premier League, as well as the title races in both leagues, so the promotion push in the Championship and the title race in the Premier League. So, of course, we're going to get started with the least relevant game of the week, which is between EPL Nostradamus and TA Mac 10. Least relevant is a bit unkind, maybe, because it's just between two mid-table teams in the EFSA Premier, so there's not an awful lot to be said about it. It ought to be a close affair. A lot of the EFSA teams I've noticed when going through the matchups this week have defensive investment in the Palace against Brighton game. Two pretty solid defensive teams. Tate's going to be hoping for a 0-0, I'd imagine, with Hennessy in goal and Duffy in defence for Brighton. Chris is going to hope his attack is going to be returning points this week, given the fact that he has some pretty tricky defensive fixtures, specifically Bardsley for Burnley against Liverpool at Anfield, and of course Monreal and Leno, both for Arsenal against Manchester United this weekend. Our next game is Fantasy Gaffer against Ben Dinnery, which is a rematch of the EFSA Cup game, which Ben Dinnery very controversially called a bye. He said it was as good as a bye, and of course he subsequently lost that game. Ben, as a Newcastle fan, no doubt will be pretty upset about the fact that Sean Longstaff is now out for the rest of the season, having started pretty brightly in the Newcastle shirt, and he'll be doubly disappointed because obviously he's part of his EFSA squad, as you can see, but he is now out for the season. John, on the other hand, has lost Sol Bamba, and the goals that he often provides, not many clean sheets, of course, for Cardiff, but is always a threat from set pieces. Ben will be hoping to keep up with the longest winning streak, active winning streak, that is, in all of the EFSA. 6 wins in a row for him now, and it's taken him into a tie for the lead at the top of the Premier League. It's a three-way tie at the moment. One of the other teams involved in that three-way tie is, of course, Fuzzy Warbles. This is another huge game in terms of top against bottom. Very similar to last week when we had a couple of those. Fuzzy, shockingly, slipped up last week against Nicarg. Jason got a huge win against Gavin in his own sort of relegation fight. I would say Jason's got some pretty good fixtures this week, actually, and if there's a repeat for Fuzzy in terms of Mane and Aguero not really showing up for either Liverpool or City this weekend, then we could be looking at a definite upset here. Well, I'd say we could definitely be looking at an upset. I wouldn't definitely call this one way or the other, that's for sure. Our next game is between Nicarg and TR Kingston, which is the other top versus bottom game in the Premier League this week. It's another huge one because TR Kingston is another one who lost last week. Again, very much a week for upsets last week. Nicarg getting that huge win, like I mentioned, against Fuzzy. TR Kingston coming up short. He will hope to get back on track, but what I would say is that with him and Fuzzy staying where they are, that there's potential defensive issues with Kingston's team this week, which would suggest actually that if Ericsson shows up and if the result between Brighton and Palace goes the way of Nicarg, as in if it's a 0-0, very similar to what Tate wants, then we could see another upset on the cards. I don't want to be calling too many upsets because you can end up looking a bit silly, but it's definitely on the cards, I would suggest. Now, this game between WRI Gavin and Roto Z Droik could have some relegation implications. Roto Z Droik is not particularly comfortable on 8 wins. He and Fancy Gaffer are both on the same amount of wins. He'll want to win in order to kind of pull away, whereas Gavin's going to be kind of desperate to keep up the title challenge with a win this week. He's running out of games, and he is 2 wins behind that group of 3 at the top at the moment. He's got a really tough game on his hands, I would suggest, though. Watford's last away game, of course, was at Anfield, and up against Man City and against Leroy Sané. You wouldn't want to be in that sort of situation. And not to mention the fact that Droik's got one of the form players in the Premier League at the moment. Yet again, it's a Manchester United player, and this time it's Romelu Lukaku against Arsenal, who so rarely keep clean sheets. Of course, it's important to bear that in mind. And of course, look at the table before we move on to the Championship here. There's that three-way tie at the top between Kingston, Fuzzy and Ben. Gavin, actually not 2 wins behind, I should say just 1 win behind at this point, but on a 2-game losing streak. We'll be hoping to kind of turn that around. And then you got the battle for relegation. Anyone from sort of 7th downwards, so John, Drake, Jason and Nickard, all in a little bit of bother, I would suggest. 1 win for any one of those 4 would feel huge, I would imagine, going into the what is definitely the business end of the season, as if we weren't in it already. Now, Game 6 here is between FPL MNOP and Gary Irwin. Smokey sprung one of the upsets of the season, never mind last week, by beating Yamar last week, Ryan last week. If he's to win again, he'll have to do it without Alexis Sanchez, who's now out for the rest of the season, as if his season could get any worse. He's not really contributed anything, really, if we're being brutally honest. But step forward instead, Declan Rice, who of course scored a goal against Newcastle last week, and in the EFSA points managed to get 26, which is a pretty solid contribution. Gary's promotion push, which we were talking about a few weeks ago, seems to have fizzled out a little bit, unfortunately, so I suppose his misfits will have to wait until next season for their shot at glory. Not that it's completely over yet, but it's not likely. We've got our next game between Tom Sunderland and DFS Hambazaza. Tom is one of those in another 3-way tie at the top of the championship this time. And you look at Mohamed Salah in his team and you think he's got to come good at some point, hasn't he? Surely. Pretty much since the point that he traded him in, he's not really returned the goods, as it were. But Liverpool do well generally at Anfield, and so does Salah, but his last game at against Watford, I should say, in that 5-0 thrashing, he contributed very little, and surely it'll be very difficult to kind of keep a good man down, as it were. Burnley in particular, I should say, actually will probably make it pretty difficult for Liverpool. They're a very organised team, difficult to beat, especially when they go away from home to the big teams. But you look at the potential for points for Hesh, and there's not an awful lot that kind of jumps out. I mean, you'd suggest there's some value from Wan-Bissaka and Antonio, but elsewhere could be a bit of a tricky week for him. Now we move on to our next one between CJ Radoon and Roto Wire Andrew. Now this is another kind of a mid-table game, doesn't have an awful lot of implications on either side of the table. But we've got Paul Pogba, who should be absolutely ready to go against Arsenal, having been suspended, of course, in the midweek miracle for Manchester United against PSG. But remember, Arsenal very defensively shaky, so Pogba will fancy his chances at some contribution in the attacking third of the field. Now, Fabianski for CJ Radoon leads the league in saves at the moment, but he's only recorded 5 clean sheets all season, which West Ham will be pretty disappointed with. Elsewhere, I would look at Gabriel Jesus, and are we going to be maybe looking at him starting this game? I would suggest not. I mean, even with a view towards the midweek game against Schalke for City in the Champions League, I would have thought that Aguero would still start, given it's been about a week since his last game, and he would maybe get pulled off at some point in the second half, so possibly an hour, and then Jesus comes on to try and get some minutes in his return from injury. Now, the final game in terms of the title race, actually no, this isn't the final one at all. This is just the second part of the title race installation in the Championship. Is between Ryan and Neil J. Thurman. Now, as I mentioned, Yamal lost again last week. That's 2 in a row now for him, which is very disappointing. But I would expect Dele Alli, currently on injured reserve for Ryan, to be available again in some capacity this week against Southampton. He's returned to full training this week, and he is a player who can definitely make Spurs click, particularly in the absence of form of Heung-min Son and also Eriksen, who's kind of just fallen by the wayside a little bit for Tottenham. I said last week that Ryan would beat Smokey absolutely no problem, and I proved to be wrong, which means I have absolutely no hesitation in saying that Ryan will undoubtedly win again this week. we move on to our final game between Jay Forker and Sports by Gotti. Now, Jay Forker's really fought himself a spot into the three-way tie at the top of the championship table, because he's won 4 wins, 4 games in a row, I think, is what the stats say. And the fact that De Bruyne is out for Man City, and more specifically in this case for Gotti, is going to be pretty big for Jay in this particular week. There should be enough points on offer for him to keep up the promotion push, as it were, and keep his win streak going. But I expect a tight game, as always. So the table, like you can see again, there is that 3-way tie at the top, 16 wins for Yamar, Jay Forker and Tom Sunderland. Gary maybe just fallen by the wayside a little bit in terms of the promotion push. They're running out of games if you really want to put a challenge together now. And then after that, I would suggest people are definitely out of it. So it's between those 4 teams, you'd say, in terms of getting promoted to the Premier League next season. So that's going to do it for this week. I hope you enjoyed this week's video. As always, if you want to leave a comment, then please do. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it. You can follow us on Twitter. I've put both of our Twitter handles in the description, both for me and the EFSA as well. Other than that, all that remains to be said is good luck for this week, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye for now.